justice as our fifth pillar. As Rivlin so aptly pointed out, repairing the world should include not only direct human services, but a duty to the earth itself. We must protect our wildlife, plants, trees, and water so that our children and grandchildren can inherit a better world. Just today, the Washington Post reported that the UN climate change report warns that we are on the brink of catastrophic warming. So this is not an issue to be dealt with in the future. This is an issue we must address now. So it may seem like this is a topic that can only be handled on a national or global basis, but our panelists tonight, our experts, are here to tell us that environmental justice begins on the local level, bottom up. Things like water quality, food waste, land use can and must be tackled locally. Our panelists are going to explain to us what each of us can do individually or in small groups right here at home on the East End to make a difference in the health of our planet. Let me introduce our panelists. And thank you to all our panelists. We are so grateful that you've joined us. Bob DeLuca, Group for the East End. Bob has served as the president and CEO of Group for the East End since 1992, where he has been recognized and honored by a wide range of community conservation and governmental entities for his work on conservation and civic advocacy. Bob is also a biologist and senior environmental analyst of Eastern Long Island for the Suffolk County Office of Ecology and an adjunct professor for Long Island University, Southampton. Since 1972, the Group for the East End has led the way in protecting and restoring the environment of Eastern Long Island through education, conservation, and advocacy with government, civic organizations, and fellow environmental groups, fighting to protect our land, water, and wildlife. The group has advised on development plans, zoning codes, land use policy, and funding solutions for environmental problems. The group is also interested in inspiring children to become responsible stewards for our land and water. Josephine DiVincenzi, Carbon Crew. Josephine is a retired educator with 38 years of experience in teaching, coaching, and administration. When she retired, Josephine put her planning and organizing skills to work by founding the Carbon Crew Project with two friends in 2021. The mission of Carbon Crew is to help reduce global warming from the bottom up by empowering local groups of individuals or crews to design their own blueprints for reducing carbon footprints. And Josephine will tell us how we can do that later. Suffolk County legislator Al Krupski, owner of Krupski's Pumpkin Farm. Al has devoted many years to public service, serving for 20 years on the Southold Town Board of Trustees, 14 as president, 8 years on the town's Southold Town Board, and as a Suffolk County legislator since 2013. Looking at Al's resume, it is easy to see Al's commitment to the environment, having spearheaded the effort to rewrite Southold's wetland code, worked on a town-wide drainage code to reduce road runoff, helped develop Southold's first wind energy code, and supported rezoning Plum Island to preserve over 600 acres of open space and habitat. Frank Quevedo, Executive Director, South Fork Natural History Museum. Frank has been the Executive Director of the South Fork Natural History Museum since 2010. Prior to his current position, Frank worked for the town of East Hampton as a bay management specialist and currently serves as the president and co-founder of the South Fork Sea Farmers Organization. The South Fork National History Museum and Nature Center is the only state-of-the-art Natural History Museum on the South Fork of Long Island. Founded in 1988 and housed in Bridgehampton, the museum is devoted to stimulating interest, advancing knowledge, and fostering appreciation of our natural environment through hands-on interactive exhibits and guided educational experiences. Abby Clow Lawless, The Perfect Earth Project. Abby is the principal of Farm Landscape Design, which specializes in creating spaces that respect the natural grace and simple rhythms of farm life and resonate within the indigenous environment within which she is working. Abby is here representing the Perfect Earth Project, a nonprofit organization that promotes toxin-free land management and landscape solutions. The project is dedicated to rethinking landscape design to prevent soil erosion, promote lawn alternatives, create more efficient watering systems for plants, trees, and crops, and support the birds and the bees. Abby is also involved with Change Hampton, an organization that promotes restorative landscaping through replacing turf lawns with native plants whose root systems clean out toxins in the soil. I'd also just like to give a quick shout out to Rameshwar Das, the chair of the East Hampton Waterfront Advisory Committee, who was instrumental in helping to put this panel discussion together. So that is our very illustrious expert panel. And I wish we had more time to delve deeply into all of these issues, but we'll do what we can. We plan on making this webinar an hour long, and some of our panelists have to leave promptly at 1 hour. But if any of the other panelists and our audience are willing to stay a little longer, maybe an extra 15, 20 minutes, we'll try to address some of the many questions, many good questions that the audience has sent in beforehand. So I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists to describe the work of their organizations in greater detail and to tell us what they think are the biggest environmental challenges facing the East End today and what those root causes might be. So let's start with Bob.
Sure, and thank you, and thanks to all my colleagues and everyone who's joined us. It's really important to have as many people on the ground doing as much work as we can, as often as we can, as long as we can do it. So having kicked around doing this for a while, I'm most appreciative of the cavalry whenever they arrive. So just briefly on the group was founded in 1972, and about that time, the Long Island Expressway and the Sunrise Highway had both reached Eastern Long Island. And it was a wake-up call for people who started to realize by driving through Western Long Island what was likely to happen to Eastern Long Island. And the group's genesis came about with a coalition of farmers and baymen and second homeowners and general residents who cobbled together an organization. And the principal goal of that organization, and now we call it green infrastructure, but it was to design a landscape based on the limitations of the region's natural resources. And the very first thing the group did is there was a grant from the Whitehall Foundation that started things we take for granted today: mapping, looking where wetlands were, trying to figure out the coastal zone, and trying to fuel a transformation in land use that would help us not result in the congestion of Western Long Island, but also be sustainable because of the resources that lie beneath us, like our water and the fragility of being 75 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean and trying to survive here, as well as the natural resources of farmland, which was, vital to the economy since colonial settlement and before. So from our perspective, everything really comes down to land use. And we can talk a little bit later about some of the specifics, but really what you do with the land, what you do on top of the land, we're all part of one water cycle. And so in many places, when you think about a reservoir, there's a fence someplace and behind it is the water. We walk around on it every day. So whatever we do on top of the ground is going through that water. That kind of pollution, what can happen there, also has effects on what it costs to draw water, what it costs to clean water, which has climate effects. How much we build also has climate effects. And probably the biggest protection we have is land preservation. So instead of thinking about saving a tropical rainforest, here on the East End, every acre that we can protect of woodland, farm field, old field area is directly related to helping us combat the issues of climate change. And we'll talk more, I guess, a little bit more in detail, but the group works through advocacy, education, and really hands-on stewardship. Those are really the three tools, trying to help develop government programs and advocate for those programs, trying to prevent irresponsible development from getting a foothold, taking root, and finally helping people to love and cherish this place for all of its natural beauty and wonders, because we believe, that's we say education is the gateway drug to advocacy. Once you care about it, you don't mind stepping up for it. So that's kind of what we do, how we do it, and what we think is important.
Thank you, Bob. Al, you want to take it?
Thank you. And thank you for that nice introduction. And thank you very much for having me. I find that, to Bob's point, that involvement from the community is really critical. As a longtime elected official, it's really good to have input and people who are actually interested in what's going on. I think to your point, Andrea, about the making the world a better place for the next generation, whenever I speak to young people, I always tell them they should pay attention because we're spending your money. So it is hard to get young people engaged, but it's really important. So, Bob spoke about how important land preservation is and land use is, and you can't understate that. The stormwater thing, we as a town trustee, we realized it was a problem. Stormwater going into our creeks and bays and sound. It carried sediment, it carries pathogens, and it carries nutrients. So we were very concerned about that decades ago, and without realizing it, a lot of those efforts not only helped clean the water bodies so that people can shellfish and certainly swim in our bays and creeks, but it also recharges the aquifer directly. And as you go parcel by parcel, which is what we did, permitting things, every parcel had to be drainage compliant. And then we did that on a town-wide scale upland, so that you only get so many inches of rainfall every year. And if we recharge and capture that rainfall, we have a chance, at least as far as the aquifer is concerned. As energy conservation, I just got an email today from DPW, Bridget Fleming, the legislator on the South Fork, and I co-sponsored legislation in 2019 mandating that the county give us a report every so often on energy conservation projects. And the county's been been a leader for a long time in energy conservation projects. And the report actually outlines the money spent on the project and then the time it's going to take to recoup that money. And it's pretty encouraging because we're reducing our energy use in a very big county with a lot of infrastructure. So that's a good thing, reducing the energy use, and also obviously saving taxpayers money, because in the long term, those projects get paid for pretty quickly. And as far as the shoreline hardening and the coastal erosion and sea level rise issues, working with, there's a small project down at Cedar Beach, the county park here in Southold. The bulkhead is back from the 70s. It needs to be replaced. So we had a group meeting last week with county executives, people, the county DPW, people from Cornell Cooperative Extension, working on putting in a low sill bulkhead on a part of it so that you'd have vegetation behind the bulkhead that would be flooded twice a day. And so it would reduce some shoreline hardening while still maintaining that basin that they need for their workboats. So there's a lot, and someone mentioned food waste. Maybe somebody else wants to talk about that later on. But composting is also as a farmer, near and dear to my heart, because it does come down to soil health. It's very critical when it comes down to sustainability of agriculture in this country and food security, and it really everything ties into soil health.
Thank you very much, Al. Josephine, tell us about Carbon Crew and the issues you think are most important facing us.
Thanks. And thanks to Rabbi Dan and Rivlin and you for organizing this important event, because perhaps the most important thing we can do to solve climate crisis is talk about it. So tonight is one of those opportunities, and I thank you for it. Carbon Crew is a project that two friends of mine, I think, are on this call. We helped create this, what we call a book club with a mission. And our mission is to empower people to reverse global warming. We connect climate conscious people, like the people on this call, with one another in small groups. We call it CREW. CREW stands for Carbon Reduction for Earth Well-Being, but it also represents how we function as small groups, 6 to 8 people, reading a book that we find very engaging, that is focused on the things that we can do as individuals, called 2040. It's also the name of a very important film that highlights the key ideas and the key issues confronting us. And so our group meets in 5 sessions and discusses this book in depth, 2 chapters at a time. It is perhaps the most stimulating, fun, not downing, but rather uplifting and impactful hour that I spend in the week when I run crews. Because remember, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Margaret Mead, it was our inspiration in starting this. And we have been working now for 2 years to try to scale it up. And today's conversation is one of many we've had with different groups to try to encourage them to become a part of a crew. In the last 36 years that I've lived in Sag Harbor, I've witnessed some incredible things about the change in population patterns, traffic patterns. Even when we expanded the road, it didn't last very long. We see a lot of cars, a lot of people, a lot of farmland that is now broken up and made into these big estates. And we're seeing, as a result of all of that change that we can see locally, it's happening globally too. And so the impact of warming winters, especially out on the East End, has created probably here one of the hotspots for what has been for me on a personal level, having had Lyme disease 4 times. I could tell you that according to Mary Beth Pfeiffer, a researcher, medical researcher, Lyme disease is probably, and it's the title of her book, Lyme, the first epidemic of climate change. This disease is spreading not only through the population of the eastern end of Long Island in great numbers, but around the warming globe. Millions of people have been impacted. And the root cause, as we all know, boils down to the burning of fossil fuels and the warming that's resulted from this. The elimination of farmland and covering it over instead of sequestering carbon, how it's decreased our ability to cope with these changes. The use of broad spectrum insecticides and pests that has killed some of the things that used to eat ticks. To stay with that for a moment. I know that we have an expert here talking about the non-native trees and shrubs that continue to decrease our bird and mammal population, because they don't know how to cope with the kinds of plants that some of the large estates are planting. You see, climate change is not so much a science problem, it's a human problem. And our work in Carbon Crew focuses on trying to create that knowledge, reverence, respect, and compassion for not only ourselves, but all living things on this planet. This is truly regeneration. And we stress in our project the work of Paul Hawken in Project Drawdown. And he has given us the principles that guide regeneration, that should guide every action, every decision we make about what we eat, what we wear, where we go, and what we do. And if we could ask ourselves, which we do during the course of our conversations, these 5 sessions that we break this book down and analyze, we should ask ourselves that series of questions. Does the action we're about to undertake create more life or destroy it? Does it heal the future or reduce and steal the future? Does it enhance our well-being or diminish it? Does it prevent disease or profit from it? Does it create livelihoods or destroy them? Reduce land or degrade it? Increase global warming or decrease it? Serve human needs or manufacture human wants? Reduce poverty or expand it? Does it promote fundamental human rights? You know, today is the UN Day designated for happiness, and you can't be happy if you're not healthy. Does it provide workers with dignity or diminish them? In short, is the activity extractive or regenerative? By employing those kinds of questions and guidelines, which are outlined in Paul Hawken's book, Regeneration in One Generation, you can pivot and start rethinking action by action, bit by bit, the steps you need to take to create a more regenerative life.
Thank you so much, Josephine. Frank?
So thanks for having me today. Every opportunity that I can have to express my feelings, whether it's climate change or changes in the environment, natural changes in the environment, I'm very happy to express my input. So as you said earlier, our organization is actually celebrating our 34th year as a nature education organization. And our mission here is to stimulate interest in advanced knowledge of and foster appreciation for our natural environment, with special emphasis on the unique natural history of Long Island South Fork. And we do that twofold. We have a state-of-the-art museum located in Bridgehampton, right on the Bridgehampton-Sag Harbor Turnpike. It's 64 square feet of state-of-the-art exhibits, the interactive exhibits. There's live animals here that are ambassadors to our natural environment. We have a marine touch tank. We have exhibits throughout the museum where people can touch and feel things and use their senses as they would in the outdoors. We try to bring the outdoors indoors. And then we also produce over 250 outdoor nature education programs each year, all different variety of interests that children may have or adults, from owl walks to salamander searches, to bird surveying, to bio blitzes, to plant excursions, visiting different wetland habitats, taking people to coastal plain ponds and vernal ponds, interacting them with up-close encounters of our natural environment. And we feel that the only way that you're going to resonate how important our natural environment is by having them actually, encounter these natural wonders that we have here on the South Fork. And just to give you some ideas of this past weekend, we had 3 really unique programs that were well attended and they were very informative. The first one was early Saturday morning, presented by Dr. John Tenacredi of Malloy University, and he spoke about the ecology of our horseshoe crabs here on the South Fork and throughout Long Island. And it's pretty amazing that the horseshoe crab has survived 5 mass extinctions. They've been around 455 million years. So just to give you some idea of that kind of information that we provide to the community, to have the sensitivity, to have the understanding of what it means to protect something. If we feel that if you don't understand something, how are you going to protect it? So it's important that education is the key component here. When you educate people and they get involved, they will understand it and then they will make a difference. They will protect something that they understand. The second program we had yesterday was, on Saturday, was another informative program given by Andy Gates of the East Hampton Land Acquisition Management Department. And he's the chief environmental analyst, and he took us on a walk through the pine forest off of 114 to talk about the southern pine beetle invasion. That is an effect from climate change. We're seeing different invasions of exotic pests now coming into our environment and decimating a lot of our habitat, our native habitat. And unfortunately, in some instances, we kind of lose the management perspective of dealing with this pest because it's starting to get out of hand. You know, the last 30 years, we've been having this business as usual mentality. Somebody else will take care of it. Somebody else will take care of the problem and resolve the issues that are going to occur in the future. Well, here we are now, and I think Bob mentioned this at the pre-meeting we had a couple of weeks ago. We're in a crisis situation here, and we have to do something now, or else we're going to lose everything. In 30 years since I've been on Long Island and educating people about the natural world, I've seen tremendous changes in the environment. When I first came out here, eelgrass was everywhere. The eelgrass habitat, which plays a major role in development of finfish and shellfish, especially our peconic-based scallops. You need eelgrass habitat in order to develop and get to that next stage in order to sustain their species. But I can't find an eelgrass, a thick eelgrass bed on the East End anymore. There's little patches that's left. And I believe that's a result of climate change. And the warming climate is a result of these eelgrass habitats not being able to sustain themselves. They need cool waters and they need good water quality. Because of warming temperatures, we're also seeing an increase in harmful algal blooms that are occurring. They're lasting longer. We're seeing red tides. We're seeing low oxygen levels occur in areas where there used to be an abundance of marine life. And now we're seeing dead zones where things are just not being able to reproduce and sustain the ecosystem that was evolved here for thousands of years. And then Saturday evening, another program that we did a spotted salamander search in one of our vernal ponds in a Long Pond Greenbelt right behind my museum. And it was amazing how many people did not realize that vernal ponds are glacial relics from the glaciers receding thousands of years ago. It was all new news to them. And it's really rewarding to see the children involved. You know, it's really rewarding to see kids paying attention, you know, looking at you like you're kind of strange, but at the same time absorbing all that information, and hopefully they will get it. You know, that's the next generation that's going to carry the torch after we leave this planet. And we hope that they will get the tools to understand the sensitivity of the environment and be stewards of the environment, you know, for many years to come. And that's the rewarding part of our organization. You know, we produce all these different diversified programs for all different age groups. We go to libraries and schools and libraries come here. We go to senior living centers. We produce programs there. So we try to really aim at reaching all market groups as best we can in order to get that message across that the natural world is not something that's going to sustain itself. We have to protect it. So the root causes, I believe, are for global warming, of course, are sea level rises. You know, I think one of the things people don't know about, which I think Bob can, you know, discuss, is that our most valuable resource on Long Island is our groundwater. And with rising sea levels and possible storm surges and flooding in the future, which is inevitable, it's going to happen. You know, we live on an island, and it's just a matter of time before we get that big storm that's going to happen here someday. It's inevitable. I'm telling you, everyone, it's going to happen. And we need to do everything we can to protect our drinking water, because that is the most valuable resource that we have here on Long Island. So there's also the biggest challenge really for me as an environmental leader and a manager of a group like ours is the challenge of educating people. You know, what I can do to get the message across is the biggest challenge. And we do that every day. We're open 365 days a year. We're open from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. every day. So anybody that wants to come and learn about our natural world, our doors are always open to them.
Thank you very much, Frank. Abby.
Thanks to everyone for organizing this. Edwina, who is the founder of Perfect Earth, is traveling. I think she's without. So she asked me to speak in her place. I'm a landscape designer who's been practicing kind of non-toxic, regenerative kind of design for the past 25 years. I began my career working with Edwina in her design firm in Long Island City, and then we moved out here. And I've continued to collaborate with her on multiple independent projects, mainly in the private realm, not in the nonprofit. So although I'm not an employee of Perfect Earth, I've been a supporter, a student, and a contributor to Perfect Earth over the years. So I'm gonna do my best to speak for them. Perfect Earth was founded by Edwina with a mission to kind of promote toxic-free lawns and landscapes for the health of people, their pets, and the planet. Please check out their website, which is packed full of information on kind of the toxicity of most landscape care products. Beyond this, they propose kind of innovative, non-toxic solutions that go far beyond like kind of the current normative landscape care we see here on the East End. Edwina also started a second program called 2/3 for the Birds, which was inspired by the research of entomologist Doug Tallamy, who found that the major cause of the bird population decline is lack of food and habitat. Native birds, insects, and plants. I mean, I truthfully studied landscape architecture at Cornell, and when we were talking about plant selections back in 2003, they said you can do a native plant or you can do your Korean dogwood, which blooms on Memorial Day, right? So, but there was never a reason given back in 2003 of why I would even choose a native plant. So now we know native plants provide kind of food for the community and they're essential. And so Doug found that if, you know, everyone here started increasing their native plant population on their properties, their personal properties, they should be on all town owned properties, should have a concerted effort to plant only native. Since we all know what has happened to the native landscape of this area, it has mainly become housing. So one of the big goals here is to kind of, and there's a lot of really great groups that can give you information on native plants, including Edwina's. So the first question was, what's the biggest environmental challenge in the East End? Well, I'm going to take this I'm not a scientist, this is just anecdotal, but I think it's overdevelopment and extractive lifestyle and laws, because, and then what do you think are the primary root causes of these changes? I believe it's economic structures and culture, the main cause, mainly kind of our colonialist frameworks that we inherited, which is kind of the practice of domination and conquest, in particular over the land and people too. I'm gonna kind of skip over the community fight because I know when I spoke that there's a real interest in kind of what we can do personally. And that's kind of where my practice lies. So I'm gonna just skip to what you can do in your personal landscape. But before we go through that, I want to kind of talk to, what you start with the fact that you need to first change your relationship with your land. I need you, I would encourage you to kind of, that we've all grown up in this extractive era, and I'm as guilty as anyone, doing all kinds of bumbling around and destruction. But over these last couple of years, when I go to a property and I have a client, we think differently about the land now. It used to be like, okay, how can we put my design on the land? How can I control this? It's a lovely spot, but like, let me put little boxwoods everywhere and hydrangeas and, like control it and everything's going to stay static. We don't do that anymore. It's now you have to, and more when I come onto the land, like my own personal property, I'm like thinking, as a steward, as a caretaker, as a collaborator, like recognizing that I'm not its overseer, but I'm a partner. So it takes a real transition, because a lot of us, don't grow up with any kind of background in landscape. It's mysterious. It's, it's not anything you learned. And you can't name what you see on your it's the way our culture has developed. Landscape has been kind of background. And I would encourage you to make it part of your life. And there's a lot of joy in it. Second, I would say when you take a look at this place in particular, what are the natural systems that you live in? Research what was here before your house and lawn. Think about how you can reconnect your little plot, sorry, my paper, to the larger world beyond. Go beyond the hedges. And then I too did the Carbon Crew project, and it was really kind of a really great experience. I can't recommend it enough. It was really empowering. I just think it's a really fabulous program. And I too am kind of really blown away by Paul Hawken, but he says it best, like we need to become active in the regeneration of our landscapes. So, and he says regeneration is putting life at the center of every action and decision, which is, and so in the landscape, that's what I try and do for my clients. And then practical actions for your personal landscape. Perfect Earth has this list that I'm going to repeat. It's 13, it's not 5. And there's so much information there, but I'll just start, number 1, plant native plants. We know that. Remove invasives, use no chemicals, go electric, ask your landscaper to stop blowing. If they have to blow, there are these amazing battery powered blowers that they can use. They don't want to buy them because they're expensive. They drive in a $60,000 truck, but they don't want to spend $2,000 on the blower. Say they can't blow on your property. I think we need client-based kind of incentives saying, I'm not, like this isn't happening on my property. And the price of the blowers will go down if enough people start buying them. Maintain biomass. Ecosystems are naturally circular by nature. When we start removing everything from our property, the twigs, the leaves, it's unsustainable and you're removing nutrients. So a lot of us have landscaped every little corner of our property. I would encourage you to start thinking about stepping back a little, at least allocating a place if you're not gonna, for compost, for leaves, for the utility of this thing, but like even simple things like if you're not mowing your lawn, ask your landscaper to mow the leaves into the lawn instead of blowing them all away. Like a really simple action that keeps trucks off the road dumping leaves at the dump when they really should just go back in the earth where they belong. Mind the mulch. There's a new practice now, like taking shredded hardwood and spreading it over throughout your entire property. It's kind of a little crazy in my mind. There are living mulches, like basically small, shorter, like things like a carex or something like that, which is a short native sedge. There's many articles on living mulches that you can kind of work so that your ground is covered and you're not bringing in guys with truck who are hauling mulch around, just less work all over. It is more expensive to do that planting, but the long run, it's worth it. Water smart. This is something that Edwina has been really pushing and really trying, and it's a really hard thing to get your landscaper, if you have an irrigation system, to comply. Brown usually means if your landscape turns brown, most people are going to fire the irrigation contractor. So they're all terrified. So they swamp it. But the problem is, of course, we have a very limited aquifer. And actually, if you water intermittently and deeply, the plants will survive just fine. I'm on Shelter Island. There are no irrigation systems. Everyone's lawn is brown in August. No one cares. Like, I don't care. That is unless you've got a great crabgrass lawn, then it's nice and green. The watering is a really difficult one I know, because last year it was dry in August, down 18 inches into the earth. So it was a really hard year to convince people to like back off. But it is something that actually increases if you water intermittently and deeply. The roots go further into the soil. They need less water and they find their own water. and they'll be healthier and more resilient. So if you just water constantly, the roots sit on the surface and will never reach down, and you'll have a very fragile landscape that needs constant coddling. Prune prudently. There's been a lot back in the 90s. We were really into like sculptural trees, like prune it into this beautiful like architectural wonder, like make it. And currently, Edwina and I have really pulled back from that. We want to leave as much deadwood as safely possible, because deadwood is an incredible food supply for the birds in particular. That, you know, as these trees break down, all these insects, caterpillars in particular, and grubs are an incredible source of nutrients, especially for fledgling birds. So deadwood's good. Like, think, you know, changing your perspective from like, oh, that branch is dead, I must remove it, to being like, oh, look, the woodpecker stopped there. Isn't that funny? And like, you know, so seeing the life in the cycle instead of a fixed landscape that looks perpetually like it's a teenager. Reduce your lawn size. That's obviously only lawn where you need it. I have one client, it's a small property, maybe a third of an acre. We just have a deck and he has no lawn. It's the first client I've ever had no lawn, and it's glorious. He has a path through it. That's it. And it is just really, they enjoy it incredibly, and it all comes right up to the pool. So when you're swimming in the pool, you're just looking at the meadow. It's magical, you know.
Abby, I'm going to stop you there because
Okay.
you've given us way more than 5, which is fabulous. The more, the better. But I want to make sure we have time for our other panelists to give us their advice. But that was incredibly helpful. And I encourage the audience to get in touch with Abby or Project, why am I?
Perfect
blanking?
Earth. Yeah.
Perfect Earth, to find out what you can do specifically to make your lawn and your property more sustainable. So let's move on to the other of our panelists. Bob, can you give us thought? Because this is the question we most got from our audience, which is what can we do now, today? So can you give us your list?
Sure. And let me just say this starting off. The first thing you can do is change your perspective that the earth is a victim. The earth is will be here after we're here. And we should look at the earth as a partner in its healing rather than a passive bystander. And I think if you do that, you develop a lot of strength in your own approach and patience in your own approach. The more you act like the earth, the more you have long-term thinking. And we don't do much of that. So I would just encourage everyone to kind of keep that in mind and believe that you can make a difference, because if you don't get to that place first, all of this is not going to help, because you're just going to say, you know what, I hear every day that the ice sheets are melting and I'm going to give up. So don't give up, believe that you can, and believe that the earth is here and all of its wisdom to help you. And that gets you moving a little bit forward. I think, specifically, what can you do? I look at it this way. Like I looked at, like everybody's busy and everybody has too much to do and everybody has too much stuff in their house and all that stuff. I tried to do one big project in my house, and it's not a huge project, to deal with this issue as a family. And so what we did was we got a solar. I don't have enough light because I didn't cut all my trees down to be able to do, photovoltaic, but I have a solar thermal hot water system in my house. And it is the best thing that I have ever done in terms of oil pricing. And I used to have, I have 2 kids. They never get out of the shower. I'm the environmental guy banging on the door. It still doesn't work. But this thing, every day I got warm water, and it only has to be heated up like 10 degrees as opposed to taking it from 55 degrees or whatever. So one big thing that you can look at every day, you can declare victory. It does make a difference. You can measure the difference. You can go crazy with these things. I would say try to do one big thing, and you can look up a million different things that work for you. The second thing is the kind of slow blocking and tackling of doing any progressive change over time. Don't look too far. I remember my old football coach used to, don't look at the finish line. Just look like 2 feet in front of you. And if you can do that and just go like to each room in your home. I just did it today, actually. I went down and like, what's the den, right? And I'm looking around, and I still have like a couple of incandescent bulbs. I don't know when they got there. I don't know who put it. Like, just do like a regular family audit through the house, and you'll probably spend like $100. and it's not the end, it's not the biggest thing you'll ever do, but you do it and it's done, and you change out the lighting, and you stop having everything turned on with that vampire electric where everything has got a light on it, get yourself a power cord and turn everything off. I mean, that stuff all sounds really small, but if there's 8 billion people on the planet, if 8 billion people ever did anything once, it would make a difference. So I'm a big believer in trying to have the one thing that's like the iconic thing that you do, and then sort of chipping away when you can, as often as you can, and going back and revisiting that as a place to start. Stepping back just a little bit further, I would say 95% of the landscape that we live in is based on thousands of decisions made in town halls all across the East End of Long Island. Planning board, zoning board, town board. What do you build? Where do you build it? And what's it made out of? The what's it made out of is really important when you talk about climate change, because your building materials can have a lot to do with energy efficiency, and we should be pushing that as often as we can. We're also supportive of wind turbines. Some people think that's a bad idea. Some people, we have to do something other than fossil fuels, but you can make specific points to your elected leadership to say, look, how are the building codes here? We have a comprehensive plan. What does it say about this? Does it say anything? Can we implement something better than we have right now? And along those same lines, where's the energy for land preservation? I was around here when we first created the Community Preservation Fund, and because it was an absolute house fire crisis, for about 10 years, everybody behaved themselves. And then slowly over time, it's a pot of money, which is very attractive for all kinds of things. And you have to constantly remind people why we did this, what people voted for, and why it matters. So the land use piece, land preservation goes hand in hand with that. Every single person on this Zoom can go to town hall. Most of them have a public portion. Tell them it's important. Elected officials, they get picked on all the time, sometimes by people like me. But they're waiting for people to tell them what the priorities are. There's a million things they could do. And when people show up in an organized fashion and tell them what they want, you'd be surprised how often they'll try to do it, right? But we don't show up. We don't show up in town hall. They get sick of seeing guys like me. But the more people who show up, ask about that. And one where I'll tell you where we've made some progress is this leaf blower madness, right? We got to stop. I mean, you run a leaf blower for half an hour. I know the statistic because my son looked this up, where they ran a Ford Raptor from Texas to Alaska, and it produced less hydrocarbons than running one of those awful blowers for like half an hour in your backyard, because it's a 2-stroke engine, right? And it just burns the oil. We got to stop with those things. And some communities are starting. Southampton is starting. The villages are starting to do this. Southold tried a little bit, could probably do better. That alone, I always tell my kids, I say, when the last drop of gasoline is finally used up, we're going to sit back and say, did we really spend it on the right thing? Having guys blowing the gutters, blowing the grass back and forth between each other, blowing the street. I could do surgery on the street next to my house. I mean, there's not a speck of anything, because when those guys come, there's like 5 guys spending an hour blowing. Stop the blowing. And landscaping, I'll also say, and Abby touched on a lot of this, but my God, get a rake. Leave the grass clippings. What are we doing? Like it's like building the pyramids. Stop it. We just have to stop that. Stop getting giant bags of fertilizer and dumping them, and then they kill the lawn because it's too much nitrogen. Then you rip up the lawn and you put in sod, and the sod doesn't want to grow there because that's not where it's from. And then you spend your whole life putting the grass that's on life support trying to make it green. You just stop. If you got a better landscape on your property and you got rid of all of the wasted electricity in your house, and you did one big thing, and you went to town hall every once in a while and griped about stuff that you think is important, we would make a huge difference. We really would. And I've been at this a long time. I guarantee you this stuff, it can work. So I advise you that in my 5 minutes. And the last thing I'll say, coastal zone management, we're never going to get the politics straight on getting people off the coast. Here's what's going to happen. There's going to be a massive storm and everything's going to get wiped out. And if we don't have a post-storm recovery plan that tells us what we can build back and how, we're going to have the same problem for the next 100 years. And eventually we'll have no beach because everybody's going to harden the shoreline. You got to have post-storm recovery planning in a place like this. Climate change only accelerates the need, and it's been hard to get.
Thank
That's
you very much, Bob. I know that Al and Frank have to leave at 7. Al has a hard stop at 7. So Al, why don't you go next, and then Frank and Josephine. I hope you can stay with us a little longer, and look forward to hearing what you've been doing and what we can do. So Al.
Thank you. So I think everyone's kind of making the point about changing the culture of how we view our natural environment, and not just using it up and not looking for today, but really thinking about how it affects tomorrow. I think one thing, and maybe because I grew up on the farm, you reuse everything. You've got you don't have to throw it out. You could save it, be a little organized, and next time you need something, whether it's and you should see my barns, but maybe it's a piece of string or an old cultivator tooth, but you'd be surprised. And so if you can reuse a lot of your things that you have in your household, even just one time, you're really saving a lot. And if people have that mindset of not just throwing it out, and the next time you need something, having to drive to the store to get something, I think that would go a long way. The dark skies issue, we go out tonight and you look at the stars, and it's kind of magnificent, and it kind of puts your life in perspective. There was a big dark skies movement years ago, and I think it was pretty successful, but I don't think we can let that go. I think we have to make sure that it's part of our culture, because you still have the night skies out here, and you can obviously lose them very quickly. Pollinator habitat. It's amazing to see, because people talk about honeybees, because the bees make the honey and we make the money. So honeybees are a very important feature. But if you look at all the native pollinators, there's so many different bees, bumblebees, the little tiny sweat bees, and all the wasps. There's so many native pollinators, and they do need habitat, and it doesn't take much. I think Abby said it, to leave a part of your yard, just let it be naturalized, so that the pollinators have a chance to have some habitat. I mean, what we see on the farm is it's amazing when we have, sunflowers or something growing, or the pumpkins bloom. The amount of pollinators and the diversity of pollinators is really impressive. So I think pollinator habitat is, and it goes back to what Bob said about land preservation. So it's up to the towns, up to the county to keep up with the land preservation, because that money is a dedicated funding stream for that. And you look at, people tend to think, well, I saw a bald eagle today, but it's about everything. It's about every species that needs a bit of habitat to survive. The personal irrigation thing, coming from a farm, you irrigated to keep things alive, and you weren't worried about the appearance as much as just keeping everything, bringing everything, the crop in. So the irrigation thing is again, the culture changed 20 years ago. Not everybody had lawn sprinklers, and now it's like, I'm lucky where I live, nobody can see my lawn, because it does get quite brown in the summertime. But that's just part of the natural process. So I think people have to rethink that. I've been part of a number of different groups trying to get their handle on how to control the amount of water used just for lawns, because that water is being pumped out of a public supply well in one central location, putting stress on the aquifer in one spot, and then it's being treated to drinking water standards. And then you see it gets run down the street half the time. You see the sprinklers going off, and it runs down the curb, and it runs down the sidewalk. And it's a lot of that water is just completely wasted. It's not used on a landscape. So that's something that and as a homeowner, if you have a sprinkler system, you really need to, I guess, take some responsibility for how much water you're actually using. And then, as far as what Bob's comment of making sure that elected officials know what's important, that's really critical, because elected officials only know what we know. And you talk to different people in government, and you learn a lot, but the public is a wealth of information. And so being active in town government, because our decisions are based on input. And so you could hire a consultant to do something, or you could listen to what people on in your community have to say, because that's a really critical component. So being active in your especially in your local government is really impactful. Thank you. And thanks for this opportunity. This is great.
Thank you very much, Al. I know you may have to leave us soon, but thank you so much for participating tonight. Frank. Frank, you need to unmute.
Sorry about that. My dog was barking before and I had to mute myself. So I wrote down a couple of things, but everybody pretty much hit on them. But one of the things that I think are really important that people can do right away to combat climate change is to plant native plants and trees on their property, and to sustain the biodiversity that has naturally evolved over hundreds and thousands of years to create the ecosystem that we have here. So when people continue to plant native plants and wildlife, that continues the pollinators to return and do their job as to what they need to do. Also, one of the things that I think people don't realize is that when you consume less food, you kind of eliminate that extra food that's trash after you're done. Pretty much when you're not finishing your meal, you're throwing those scraps in the garbage. And what's happening is those scraps are going to landfills. And then when they break down at these landfills, they create a greenhouse gas known as methane, which is more potent than carbon dioxide. So I think people should start, composting and using scraps for other purposes, which I think is important. The other thing too is to buy local produce and, buy local produce. So this way you could eliminate packaging and transportation emissions. If you buy local, then there isn't much packaging and transportation that's taking place, creating carbon emissions to get that produce to local supermarkets. They're available right in your local farm stand. Eat less meat is another thing. I think people don't realize that cattle farms are a big part of our agricultural land use now, and most of it, 70% of it, is for cattle pastures, and cattle produce methane gas, and that is more potent than carbon dioxide. So I think if people reduce their consumption of meat, that kind of helps in that sense. And then just to plug the South Fork Sea Farmers organization that I also represent is support your kelp farmers. Kelp are carbon sequesters. So they actually hold carbon dioxide during the photosynthesis process, and all plants do. So in that matter, deforestation is a problem. So if we can keep our plants and trees alive and sustained, then they will sequester carbon on a natural perspective. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. Before we get to Josephine, I just want to remind you to take a look in the chat. Rivelin has been posting all of the suggestions made by our panelists tonight. Perhaps you want to save the chat. A lot of good information in there, along with the contact information for our speakers and their organizations. Okay, Josephine, give it to us. Oh, you're muted.
You asked us to think seriously about what solutions we can do in our home and in our advocacy work. Well, of course, I'm going to say join a crew. And thank you, Abby, for the testimonial that you gave. People, even very experienced environmentalists like the crew here tonight, learn something and get inspired and empowered to do things, because in small groups, we share information. And all that information is centered around Project Drawdown, which is the rank ordered solutions, scientifically based solutions that are in the areas that we can control in energy, transportation, sequestration, and consumption. And when we started this, the thing that inspired us the most was a UN study that came out in 2021 in the environmental program of the UN that said over 2/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions are determined at the household level. So while we can moan and groan about what will our little piece do, it'll do a lot. We are not only the problem, we're the solution. So people do matter. The choices you make every day about what you're eating. And let's start with that. If you look at the Project Drawdown solution, that's the #1 solution now that policymakers have helped change refrigerants to be less detrimental to the environment. They still are, but not as much so. The #1 way that we can solve climate crisis is in all our hands. It is eat everything, only buy what we can eat, and eat everything we buy and make a plan for the leftovers. So food waste is the #1 problem and the #1 solution to climate change. 43%, it's an obscene amount. 43% of all food in the United States goes to waste. That means 43% of your food budget you've thrown out the window. So you're not only going to help save the planet, you're going to save your food budget. You're going to save money. And if you join it, when you join a Carbon Crew, you will learn in each of these domains the key ideas that are shared amongst the small groups, the resources. Al, and your work on the North Fork as a farmer, we need to become locavores and support our local farmers. The average vegetable and fruit in this country travels 1,200 miles to your table. Ridiculous. Buy local, support your farmers, and save money too. Eat less meat, be more plant-based. That's the drawdown #2 solution. Be more plant-based in your food. Electrify everything. Get an energy audit. Of course, consider solar panels so that, and take advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm about to put this on my home. 1/3 of your costs will be covered by the federal incentives. So get a look and see if solar paneling can work for you. Buy at least a hybrid or an electric, still better, an electric car. And in consumption in that area, the #1 thing, buy fewer things, fix the things that are broken like we used to do, and talk about climate change with your friends, with your family, with your local officials. Because if we could save food waste by changing our laws like they've done in France and Italy, where they banned grocers from throwing away edible food and give it to the poor. 1 out of every 4 children goes to bed hungry. How sinful is this, that we throw it in the landfill as opposed to finding ways to get it to the people who need it? Poorest people in the world suffer the most from climate change, and they do the least to damage it. So we need to also encourage our local officials to keep encouraging family planning and education of girls. 93 million girls are not educated around the planet. If we educate girls, they have fewer children. The most significant pregnancy prevention program in New York City starts with goal setting for girls. Because when girls can think about what they might want to do with their lives, they plan backwards and realize protecting themselves and delaying maybe having a child can make a huge difference to them achieving their goals and having a better life for them and their children. In the whole land area, start encouraging best practices as legislators in agriculture. That if we start regenerative farming and using less pesticides and winter crops like we used to have that were plowed back in. Those are things that can draw down solution number 11. Support wind turbines. Understand that both on land and in the ocean, they're probably in the top 10 drawdown solutions, number 6. And as someone mentioned earlier, hey, let's push this governor to re-examine this kelp farming bill. I mean, I don't understand that veto that was just made to a plant that's the fastest sequestering carbon, the fastest is kelp. It grows like over a foot a day or a couple of feet a day. We need to eat seaweed and we need to support our kelp farmers. Thank you. Learn more, join a crew.
You got to go, Al? Okay, thank you. All I can say is, wow, that's a lot of information. I don't even know. Do you have time to stay for a few minutes to answer some of the questions that participants sent in? Okay, I mean, that's so, I'm overwhelmed, but in a good way, because it makes me realize that there is so much that we can do. And rather than feel pessimistic, we should feel optimistic that we have it within ourselves and our power to actually do something. So you've touched on a lot of the things that people have sent in questions about, but let me just ask you a couple of them. Okay. Jesse, I'm going to ask you this question because it's it deals with us as a social justice committee, and some people have asked, social justice is more about people, and how does this become a social justice issue? I imagine the connection is that in many ways, global warming impacts vulnerable society and vulnerable members of our communities more than others, because they may often live in the most vulnerable areas and neighborhoods. So can you talk a little bit about the social justice aspect of this?
Well, again, I think that when you think about how, just let's stay with the issue of food. Food in the fields that could be given to people who are willing to go out and pick up the food that harvesters don't grab, that we could find some way to make even easier the sharing of food from grocers. In my little neck of the woods, I took a large grocer and I asked the question, just go in and ask your grocer, what do you do with dated food? What do you do with produce that or stale bread, for example, that you're not going to sell, and help the grocer figure out a way to get that to the most needy in your community. I organized a cluster of friends and we went to the local big supermarket, and I was getting 3 and 4 basketfuls of baked goods that were just going to be thrown in the dumpster. I mean, that's where this changing of legislation is key. But we can find ways to support the neediest amongst us by just sharing more and sharing that information, that where it's available, how it's available, getting it to the right people who can help distribute it in food pantries. That's a huge one.
Thank you. Okay, Bob, I have a really simple question for you, which you should be able to answer in a few words. How does climate change affect a number of local issues? And this really is local. How does it affect our tourist industry, real estate values, our homeowners insurance, the municipal tax base? I was going to ask Al this as well, but can you put climate change in some sort of economic context? Because I think sometimes when it's a pocketbook issue, it reaches people that might not otherwise hear
First, let me just say, I'm glad I didn't get the tough question. Um, the old Barry Commoner phrase, everything is connected to everything else. We are a community based on the natural resources that lie beneath our feet. So whether it's agriculture, whether it's vitriculture, whether it's kelp, whether it's fish, whether it's shellfish, whether it's expensive real estate, looking at the beautiful ocean, all of that is what brings people here and what sustains the local economy. There's no doubt about that. Second home economy, multi-billion-dollar economy, if you look at real estate and everything else. There's always this thing about killing the goose that laid the golden egg, right? And we run up against that frequently because the desire to have all of those things is often cut against the planet's capacity to provide those things. So I think how it affects us is everything has a tipping point. As a biologist, we know that there are certain carrying capacities in we tend not to look at them as people, but there's a carrying capacity that this region has. And I don't know that we know the exact number. But as far as drinking the water from beneath our feet, to basically relying on the bounty of the land for the agricultural economy, the trick here is to wheel back from the edge of the waterfall before you go over and figuring out how many different ways that you can intersect with the complexity of this economy in ways that define a better environmental health and a better model for managing the long-term needs of the region. So I would say it always comes down to land use because the planning and zoning of every community dictates what that community will look like, whether it intends to or not. So the sooner that we infuse these issues into our land use policies, the better off we are, even if those land use policies are going to be implemented after some event happens, which is why I'm pushing this idea of post-storm recovery, because it's almost impossible to get people to say, I'm going to tear my house down on the edge of the ocean until nature knocks it down. But that's an opportunity. And from a strictly political standpoint, as an elected official, you can pass something that doesn't get implemented till later, right? And then if you're there when it gets implemented, you say, I didn't do it, those guys did it. That's just raw politics. But that's the way it has to work, because otherwise we're just playing footsie with the ocean all the time. And what normally happens is if you don't agree to step back, you end up with a hard structure between you and the ocean, and that hard structure inevitably rips apart the beach, and then your beach is gone and you're climbing down into the ocean, which only accelerates the damage the next time a storm comes along. So I think integrating our understanding of land use alongside our understanding of climate change and what's likely to happen to our water supply, what's likely to happen to our shorelines, what's already happening to our natural systems, whether it's pine beetle or other invasives, that's the road home. And town-wide comprehensive planning, which this region, to its credit, has done more of than lots of other places. That's the tool to look at those issues and evaluate them alongside, typically we said, well, we'd like to have the business district over here and some houses over there. And that's part of planning. But the other part is how does that set us up for what's going to happen in the next 50 or 100 years? So I don't know if that helped, but that's the prism through which I would see it.
Thank you. I'm going to have one question for Abby and one for Frank, but I just want to make a comment about what you've just said, because as someone who's a political activist, my takeaway from what you're saying, okay, can you hear me now? One of the takeaways I get as someone who's politically active from what you're saying is that you should get involved, whether, consider joining your local planning board or land use or zoning, or run for trustee, help manage and steward our land and water. So that would be something that I would suggest as a non-environmental expert, but as someone who believes that a very effective way of making change is getting people elected to positions who share these values. And
it's hard, as it's hard to get people for some of these boards. So, you may see people recycled over and over who maybe shouldn't be there or maybe are tired of being there. And unless you infuse that with newer thinking, you're going to get the exact same result that got us here. So please consider running. If you haven't run for something before, don't let that stop you.
If you have a passion and you can learn, we can help you get there.
Well, let elected officials know that you're willing to serve if appointed to a particular board, zoning, planning.
Absolutely. Abby, quick question. How much of local recycling is really recycled?
I'm not sure. I can't answer that.
Okay.
I know, when it comes to the landscape, a lot of the local, anyone where a professional landscape is taking care of it, most of it is taken away. So on the landscape side, but the rest, I think it depends on municipalities, right? I know up in New Hampshire where my father's from, now no plastic is taken. It all goes in the trash.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on that?
It's been very hard to create markets for glass and for plastic. And the more different kinds of plastic you have, the more you sort of contaminate the stream, and it becomes more expensive to tease out what it is. And mixed product recycling, right? Everything goes out in one can, increases the amount of recycling people do, but likely decreases the amount of recycling that has a viable outcome at the end. So more people put the stuff in the can, but when it gets to the transfer station, you got to have guys picking through all the stuff, trying to find out what's economic. There's a pretty good chance that we're not doing so well, even though people are trying to recycle and they're doing what they're being asked. The next part of that system has an economic piece to it, which still doesn't seem to, it's still easier to rip raw materials out of the ground and make stuff than it is to remake stuff. And that's, of course, a function of policy and economics also. We need to, Southampton Press had invited us one time to work on this, and I think either one of us ever really finished it, was to find out where it goes, right? To sort of take it and figure out where it's all ended up and what percentage can we honestly say got recycled and converted into another material. And that work still needs to be done.
The figures are not encouraging. It's probably less than 2% is really reused. So the big thing that we try to encourage in Crew is the way we do store stuff, get out of the plastic totally. The story of plastics is yet another way for fossil fuel industry, once we eliminate gasoline, to keep making and using fossil fuels to create plastics. So get away from plastic for all your storage and get to something like glass that can be used over and over and over again.
I still recycle because it makes me feel good. And and I feel like I'm doing my part that, I started many years ago. But when it goes to the recycling center and I leave the recycling center, then it's out of my hands. I don't know what happens to it, but at least I feel good recycling.
Right.
And I think we should build those patterns in so that we do it,
Makes me-
once we get the back end
Makes me
fixed.
feel like I'm doing my part.
Right.
Again, like a lot of people during the pandemic got takeout food in these horrible containers. You can bring, in some cases, your own container or share a meal. Just don't get that leftover in your refrigerator to be thrown out 4 days later.
Right. All practical solutions that we can do. Frank, last question is for you. There's a lot of interest that was expressed in getting our teens and children more involved. And I know you have a focus as well as Bob's organization on getting children involved. What suggestions do you have for
Well,
audience
most of the environmental organizations here on Long Island conduct many different programs that people can sign up for and participate in. They're all stewardship programs. They get people outdoors. They teach young children, teens, adults, depending on the variety of programs that's being planned for different age groups. But the one thing that I would like to mention is that all of these organizations have programs that people can get involved in. And that's a way of educating people and getting people involved. That's my 2 cents on that.
And I'll just add that we are starting crews in high school environmental clubs. So we're trying to get down into the high school level to those environmental teams. And we've got a wonderful environmental teacher in Southampton that's allowing us to work with her environmental club. So, and we've had professors embedding the crew concepts in their college level courses. So we're trying to get the word out, and especially getting it to high school students who can easily read and understand these materials. They've
Great.
got the most to benefit from.
Bob, anything to add? Abby, any mentoring opportunities?
Yeah, I think, Frank kind of summarized it. A lot of our organizations have different takes on this, but one thing I would say is that people should check out the events section of most organizations. Sometimes we're doing restoration work and we'll need volunteers for that. That's one kind of experience in education. We do a lot of classroom work. So we have an education team that's in the schools doing programs, and then we'll have nature outings as well. So those are kind of the three areas. I sometimes feel like just going out and actually, whether it's a beach cleanup or whether it's, trying to restore an area which has been affected by invasive species. That kind of stuff also just, as Frank said earlier, I think like, even if I do the same thing, I know my recycling, some of it's probably going in a dump somewhere, just building in that routine, because one day the hope is you get the back end fixed and you don't have to relearn. You're already set up to do it. So I would just say the more things that you can try and participate in, you'll find out what your interests are, and then do more of it.
Fantastic. Well, I think we've come to the end of tonight, although we could go for hours. And I would like to ask all of you if you would consider coming back for maybe a part 2, so we could do a deeper dive into some of the specific issues. And I hope you will all agree to join us again. So Bob DeLuca, Group for the East End, Josephine DiVincenzi, Carbon Crew, Al Krupski, who had to leave us, Frank Quevedo, Executive Director, South Fork National History Museum, and Abby Clow Lawless, the Perfect Earth Project. I want to thank all of you for your time and for your invaluable expertise in answering our questions. We do want to get involved, and we can see from the interest we had tonight, the participation, we do want to help, and people do want to get involved. So I urge all the listeners, please get involved with these organizations. There's a lot you can do. And thank you again. And thank you to Rivelin for putting this together. And thank you to Rabbi Dan and the Temple and Shelley for supporting us. And we hope to see all of you again soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Happy to
you.
come.
You know,
Thank you.